A single platoon, 20,000 enemy soldiers, no shots fired. In the chaos of World War II's final year, an American lieutenant faced impossible odds, outnumbered 400 to 1 by battle-hardened German troops. What happened next would become one of the war's most brilliant bloodless victories, a testament to American ingenuity, technological supremacy, and the power of treating enemies with dignity. This is the true story of how wit defeated weapons and how one man's courage changed the fate of 20,000. September 10, 1944, near Beaugency, France. The dust rose in columns that seemed to touch the September sky, visible for miles across the Loire Valley's gentle hills. Lieutenant Samuel Magill lowered his field glasses and felt his mouth go dry. He had been counting for 3 minutes straight, and the numbers had long since lost meaning. Trucks, half-tracks, horse-drawn wagons, artillery pieces, and men, thousands upon thousands of field-gray uniforms flowing like a river of steel down the country road toward his position. 24 years old, Magill commanded a reconnaissance platoon of the 83rd Infantry Division, 38 men, 4 jeeps, and 2 machine guns. He had been ordered to observe enemy movements and report back. What he was observing now was not a patrol or a company or even a battalion. It was an army. His radio operator, Corporal Eddie Watkins, crouched beside him in the hedgerow, his face pale beneath 3 days of stubble. "Sir," he whispered, though the nearest Germans were still half a mile distant, "that's got to be 20,000 men, maybe more." Magill knew Watkins was right. He also knew what standard military doctrine dictated: withdraw immediately, call in artillery, request air support, and avoid contact at all cost. A single platoon engaging a force this size wasn't combat. It was suicide. But something made him hesitate. He raised the glasses again, studying not just the numbers, but the nature of what he saw. The vehicles were packed with men sitting atop supply crates. White flags fluttered from several of the lead trucks, not surrender flags yet, but markers of a column under truce. The soldiers were not scanning the hills for threats. They were slouched in exhaustion, weapons slung or holstered, and at the front of the column, staff cars bearing pennants of senior officers. This was not an attacking force. This was a retreating army, and from the looks of it, an army that had been retreating for a very long time. "Get me division headquarters," Magill said quietly, "and then get Captain Morrison on the line. Tell them what we're seeing. Tell them I think they're looking to surrender." Watkins stared at him. "Sir, you want to try to take their surrender? With 38 guys?" Magill didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about something his father had told him before he shipped out to Europe. His father had served in the Great War, had fought at the Meuse-Argonne, had seen what happened when men were trapped with no way out. "The most dangerous enemy," his father had said, "is the one with nothing to lose. But the most valuable victory is the one where nobody has to die." "Call it in, Corporal," Magill said, "and then we're going to go have a conversation." To understand what Lieutenant Samuel Magill was about to attempt, one must understand the impossible situation that had brought General Botho Henning Elster and his men to this dusty French road in the first place. Elster was 53 years old, a career officer who had risen through the ranks of the Wehrmacht with competence rather than political fanaticism. In June of 1944, he had been given command of a security division in southwestern France, 20,000 men tasked with guarding the Atlantic coast and suppressing the growing French resistance. These were not elite panzer troops or fanatical SS divisions. They were garrison soldiers, many of them older reservists or young conscripts, mixed with contingents of Soviet prisoners of war who had been recruited into German service to avoid starvation in POW camps. Then came the Allied invasion at Normandy. Within weeks, the German position in France collapsed like a house built on sand. The Americans broke out from the beachhead, racing east and south with a speed that stunned even their own commanders. By late August, Paris had been liberated. By early September, General George Patton's Third Army was driving toward the German border. Elster received his orders on August 27th. Withdraw all forces from southwestern France and make for the fatherland. It was a death sentence disguised as a command. Between his position and Germany lay 400 miles of hostile territory. The French resistance, emboldened by liberation, was hunting German stragglers with vengeful fury. Allied fighter bombers owned the skies, turning daylight movement into a carnival of death. The Americans were behind, beside, and ahead of him. Elster had three choices: fight to the death, disband his army and let his men fend for themselves, or find a way to surrender honorably to the Americans rather than be torn apart by resistance fighters or picked off piecemeal by aerial strafing. He chose the third option. But surrendering 20,000 men to an enemy whose exact location you don't know while moving through enemy territory is not a simple matter of raising a white flag. It requires negotiation, communication, and above all, finding an American officer willing to accept such an unprecedented capitulation. For 2 weeks, Elster had been trying. His radio men had sent messages in French and English, seeking contact with American forces. His scouts had approached Allied positions with white flags, only to be fired upon by trigger-happy French partisans. On September 8th, his column, stretching for 15 miles when fully deployed, had crossed the Loire River at Beaugency, a medieval town that had seen Joan of Arc march through its gates 5 centuries before. Now it would witness another improbable chapter in the long story of war. Elster knew he was running out of time. His men were exhausted, nearly out of fuel, and increasingly demoralized. Some units had already begun deserting. If he didn't find an American commander soon, someone with the authority and the courage to negotiate, his army would simply dissolve into chaos, and thousands of men would die needlessly. He did not know that such a commander was, at that very moment, watching his column through field glasses from a distance of less than 1,000 yards. Magill spent 45 minutes on the radio with his superiors, and those 45 minutes revealed everything about why America was winning the war. First, he got Captain Morrison, his company commander. Morrison listened to the report, asked 3 sharp questions, and made a decision. Hold position. Don't engage. I'm coming to you with another platoon. Estimated time, 30 minutes. Then Morrison got Major General Robert Macon, division commander of the 83rd Infantry. Macon asked 2 questions. Can you keep them in sight? And can you stop them if they try to advance? When Magill answered yes to both, Macon said, "Do it. I'm sending air support and armor. If they want to surrender, we'll accommodate them. If they want to fight, we'll oblige that too." Finally, word went up to Major General Hugh Gaffey, commanding the French 4th Armored Division, and to the staff of General Patton's 3rd Army. Within an hour of Magill first spotting the column, the American military machine had swung into coordinated action. But it was what happened in those first 45 minutes, before the generals and the armor and the aircraft, that would determine whether 20,000 men lived or died that day. Magill gathered his platoon. They were a cross-section of American youth: farm boys from Iowa, mechanics from Detroit, college students from New England who had traded term papers for foxholes. Sergeant Paul Hartman, his platoon sergeant, was a 32-year-old schoolteacher from Pennsylvania who had volunteered after Pearl Harbor. Private First Class Johnny Chen, his best scout, was the son of Chinese immigrants who ran a laundry in San Francisco. Corporal Watkins had worked at a radio station in Tennessee before the war. "Here's the situation," Magill said, speaking clearly and calmly. "That column down there is trying to surrender. They're scared, they're tired, and they're trapped. The French resistance wants to tear them apart. They're looking for Americans who will treat them like soldiers, not like animals. We're going to give them that chance." "Sir," Sergeant Hartman said slowly, "there's about 500 of them for every one of us." "Yes, Sergeant, which is why we're not going to rely on firepower. We're going to rely on something better, their belief that we have overwhelming firepower. And we're going to rely on treating them with the dignity that American soldiers extend even to their enemies." He laid out his plan. It was audacious, perhaps crazy, but it was built on a sophisticated understanding of psychology, technology, and the moral exhaustion of the Wehrmacht in that autumn of 1944. First, they would make contact, carefully, formally, with military protocol. Second, they would demonstrate American technological superiority through a show of air power. Third, and most crucially, they would offer the Germans something they desperately wanted: protection from the French resistance, and treatment according to the Geneva Conventions. The key, Magill explained, is that we don't threaten them into surrender. We offer them surrender as the safest, most honorable option available. We show them that fighting us means death from the air, while surrendering to us means food, medical care, and surviving this war. Private Chen raised his hand. Sir, what if they call our bluff? What if they figure out there's only 40 of us? Magill smiled grimly. Then we'll have a very short, very exciting day. But I don't think they will. They've spent 3 years learning that Americans have unlimited resources. We're going to reinforce that belief. At 1300 hours, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Lieutenant Samuel Magill walked down the dusty road toward 20,000 German soldiers, accompanied only by Corporal Watkins and a white flag. The German column had halted. Magill could see officers moving among the vehicles, field glasses trained on his approaching figure. He walked steadily, without hurry or hesitation, his Thompson submachine gun slung across his back in a non-threatening but ready position. Watkins carried the radio on his back and a white flag in his hands. When they were 50 yards from the lead vehicle, a German officer stepped forward. He was tall, perhaps 50 years old, with the upright bearing of the old Prussian officer corps. He wore the rank insignia of a lieutenant colonel and carried a walking stick rather than a weapon. I am Oberstleutnant Friedrich von Brodowski, he said in accented but clear English. I am authorized to negotiate by General General Elster, commander of the German 89th Corps. You are? First Lieutenant Samuel Magill, 83rd Infantry Division, United States Army. I'm here to discuss your surrender. Von Brodowski's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Hope, or perhaps relief. You have authority to accept the surrender of 20,000 men? I do, Magill lied smoothly. In truth, his authority extended to exactly 38 soldiers. But he knew that negotiations required confidence, and confidence required speaking with certainty. But first, I need to understand your situation. Why are you here, Colonel? And so, standing in the middle of a French road while the September sun beat down and his platoon watched from concealment and 20,000 exhausted German soldiers waited in their vehicles, Lieutenant Magill conducted a negotiation that would have impressed professional diplomats. Von Brodowski explained their plight, the withdrawal from southwestern France, the attacks by French partisans, the desperate attempts to contact American forces, the deteriorating morale and supplies. He made no attempt to conceal their weakness. We wish to surrender honorably to American forces, von Brodowski said carefully. We have attempted to contact your commanders for 2 weeks. We do not wish to fight, but we cannot simply lay down arms and allow the French resistance to do what they have done to other German units. Magill nodded slowly. He had heard the stories. German stragglers lynched by partisan bands, prisoners beaten or executed. The French had suffered 4 years of brutal occupation. Their desire for vengeance was understandable, if not always lawful. I can guarantee your safety if you surrender to American forces, Magill said. You will be treated according to the Geneva Conventions. Your wounded will receive medical care. Your officers will retain personal sidearms until processed at POW camps. You will be fed, housed, and protected from partisan attacks. Von Brodowski's shoulders sagged slightly, the first crack in his military bearing. Lieutenant, with respect, you command perhaps a platoon. How can you guarantee protection for 20,000 men? Magill smiled. Colonel, let me show you something. He turned to Watkins. Corporal, contact Blue Line Control and request an immediate flyover of our position. Tell them we need P-47s, and we need them now. Watkins spoke rapidly into his radio handset. In truth, Magill had no idea if there were any P-47 Thunderbolts in the area. But he knew the Americans had absolute air superiority, and he was gambling that somewhere above France, some fighter bombers were looking for targets of opportunity. They waited. Von Brodowski watched him with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. Magill checked his watch, letting the seconds tick by, building tension. Then from the south came the sound, a rising howl of inline engines growing louder, closer, unmistakable. 4 P-47 Thunderbolts came in low and fast, their distinctive razorback fuselages and massive radial engines visible even at 500 feet. They roared over the German column in a perfectly choreographed line, close enough that the blast of their prop wash kicked up dust and made men flinch. The Thunderbolts climbed, banked, and made another pass, even lower this time, their bellies bristling with bombs and rockets. Magill never took his eyes off von Brodowski. He saw the German officer's face go pale, saw him track the aircraft with the expression of a man watching his own death certificate being written in the sky. "Colonel," Magill said quietly, "those planes are just 4 aircraft from 3 full fighter-bomber groups currently operating in this area. With one radio call, I can have 24 more here in 10 minutes. They each carry 2,000 pounds of ordnance, bombs, rockets, and 50 caliber machine guns. They can turn this entire column into burning wreckage before your men can disperse." He paused, letting that sink in, then continued in a softer voice. "Or you can surrender to me right now, and I guarantee that every one of your men will sleep safely tonight, will eat hot food, will receive medical care, and will survive this war. The choice, Colonel, is yours. But I need your decision within the hour." Von Brodowski stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, sharply. "I must consult with General Elster. Will you wait here?" "I'll wait," Magill said. "But, Colonel, the longer we wait, the more nervous my air support becomes. And nervous fighter pilots tend to make hasty decisions." It was a beautiful bluff, delivered with perfect American confidence. The kind of confidence that came from knowing your side had more of everything. More planes, more tanks, more guns, more food, more fuel, more of whatever this war required. The kind of confidence that made a 24-year-old lieutenant speak to a 50-year-old colonel as though he held all the cards. Because, in that moment, he did. 45 minutes later, General Botho Elster himself appeared. He was shorter than Magill expected, with iron-gray hair and the weary eyes of a man who had seen too much war. He wore his full-dress uniform, including his medals from the Great War, and he walked with the slow deliberation of someone approaching a moment of historic consequence. By now, Captain Morrison had arrived with reinforcements, another platoon bringing Magill's strength to nearly 80 men. Morrison, grasping the situation immediately, had wisely let Magill continue the negotiation. Magill had also been in contact with Major General Macon, who had authorized him to accept the German surrender on behalf of the 83rd Infantry Division. Elster saluted Magill formally. Magill returned the salute with equal formality. "Lieutenant," Elster said in precise English, "I am General Botho Elster. I command 20,180 men of the German 89th Corps. I wish to surrender my entire command to American forces. I ask that you accept this surrender with honor, and that you guarantee the safety and proper treatment of my men according to international law." Magill felt the weight of the moment. 80 men facing 20,000. One of the largest surrenders in American military history, occurring not after a great battle, but after a negotiation on a dusty road. "General Elster," he said, keeping his voice steady, "on behalf of the United States Army, I accept your surrender. Your men will be disarmed, processed, and transferred to prisoner of war facilities. You have my word as an American officer that they will be treated with dignity and according to the Geneva Conventions. You and your officers may retain your sidearms until formal processing. Your wounded will receive immediate medical attention." Elster's face showed no emotion, but his voice carried a note of relief. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I would like to discuss the logistics of this surrender. As you can imagine, moving and disarming 20,000 men requires careful coordination." For the next 2 hours, Magill orchestrated what would become one of the most extraordinary logistical operations of the war. He was in constant radio contact with division headquarters, coordinating the arrival of additional American units to take custody of the prisoners. He worked with Elster's staff to organize the German column, arrange for the collection of weapons, and identify the wounded who needed immediate medical care. By 1700 hours, 5 o'clock in the evening, elements of the 83rd Infantry Division and the French 4th Armored Division had arrived in force. The surrender was now officially being handled by senior officers with proper authority. But it was Lieutenant Samuel Magill who had made it happen. Magill who had seen the opportunity. Magill who had bluffed and negotiated and understood that sometimes the greatest victories come not from pulling triggers, but from offering dignity to desperate men. The full surrender took 3 days to complete. 20,180 German soldiers laid down their arms. The weapons count was staggering. 15,000 rifles, 3,000 pistols, hundreds of machine guns, mortars, and artillery pieces. 754 vehicles were surrendered, from half-tracks to horse-drawn wagons. The supply dumps yielded enough food, fuel, and ammunition to have sustained significant combat operations. General Elster formally surrendered his sword to Major General Macon in a ceremony conducted with full military honors. Elster and his officers were treated with the respect due to soldiers who had chosen surrender over senseless bloodshed. The enlisted men were processed, fed, given medical examinations, and transported to POW camps in the United States, where most would spend the remainder of the war working on farms or in factories, well fed and safe. The French resistance, which had been tracking Elster's column with vengeful intent, was kept at a careful distance by American military police. There were no reprisals, no lynchings, no violations of the Geneva Conventions. The Americans had given their word, and they kept it. Lieutenant Magill was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions, America's second highest military decoration. The citation read, in part, for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy, through exceptional tactical judgment, personal courage, and innovative use of available resources, Lieutenant Magill secured the surrender of enemy forces vastly superior in numbers, preventing significant casualties and demonstrating the highest traditions of American military leadership. But perhaps the most telling recognition came not from his own army, but from his former enemies. After the war, in letters and memoirs, several German officers who had been present that day wrote about the American lieutenant who had offered them a way out with honor. They wrote about the P-47 flyover that had demonstrated overwhelming power. They wrote about the professionalism and dignity with which they were treated after surrender. One officer, writing in 1952, put it this way, Lieutenant Magill understood something essential that day. He understood that we were not fighting for Hitler or for the Third Reich anymore. We were fighting to survive, to protect our men, to end this war without more pointless death. He gave us a way to do that. He gave us American power and American mercy in equal measure. That is why we surrendered to 40 men what we would never have surrendered to 40,000 who offered only vengeance. The lessons of Beaugency. What happened on that September day in 1944 near the small French town of Beaugency was more than just an unusual military surrender. It was a demonstration of principles that transcended the immediate tactical situation. First, it showed the power of technological superiority, not just as a weapon, but as a psychological tool. Those 4 P-47 Thunderbolts did more to secure the German surrender than a full division of infantry could have done. They demonstrated American air superiority in a way that was visceral and undeniable. They made it clear that resistance meant death from above, delivered with precision and overwhelming force. But the Thunderbolts alone were not enough. What truly secured the surrender was Magill's understanding that desperate men will fight to the death if they have no alternative, but will surrender gladly if offered a dignified exit. The German soldiers were not cowards. They were men trapped between Allied armies, partisan vengeance, and their own government's refusal to acknowledge defeat. Magill offered them something their own commanders could not, a guarantee of survival with honor. Second, the Beaugency surrender illustrated the importance of initiative and intelligence at all levels of command. Magill was not a general or a colonel or even a captain. He was a first lieutenant, the most junior commissioned officer rank in practical field command. By traditional military thinking, he should have withdrawn, reported the situation, and waited for senior officers to handle negotiations. Instead, he saw an opportunity and seized it. He understood that in war, timing can matter more than rank. He knew that every hour of delay increased the chance of violence, of the situation spinning out of control, of thousands of unnecessary deaths. So he acted, and crucially, his superiors supported him. Captain Morrison didn't overrule him. Major General Macon didn't dismiss his assessment. General Patton's staff didn't insist on handling negotiations at a higher level. They trusted the man on the ground, gave him authority commensurate with the situation, and backed his play. This was American military culture at its best, a willingness to delegate authority, to trust junior officers with significant responsibility, to value initiative over rigid adherence to hierarchy. It was the opposite of the German military culture that General Elster represented, where every decision required approval from higher command, where initiative was discouraged, where failure to follow orders exactly could result in court-martial or worse. Third, the Beaugency Surrender demonstrated the moral component of American military power. Magill didn't just threaten the Germans into submission. He didn't promise only destruction and death. He promised protection, dignity, and humane treatment. And the United States Army kept that promise. This matters more than it might seem. In total war, when nations mobilize all their resources and direct them toward the enemy's destruction, it becomes easy to dehumanize opponents, to see them not as fellow human beings, but as obstacles to be eliminated. The result is atrocities, war crimes, the systematic violation of the laws of war. The Americans in World War II were far from perfect. There were instances of prisoners being shot, of unnecessary destruction, of racial prejudice and vengeance. But at its core, the American military maintained a commitment to the idea that even enemies deserved basic human dignity. This was not softness or weakness. It was a recognition that how you treat your enemies says something fundamental about who you are. When Magill promised General Elster that his men would be fed, protected, and treated according to international law, he wasn't just making a tactical calculation. He was expressing a value that distinguished American power from Nazi power, that made the Allied cause not just militarily superior, but morally legitimate. The wider context, why Germany was losing the Beaugency Surrender, also illuminated in microcosm why Germany was losing the war by September of 1944. Consider the contrast. Magill had immediate radio communication with his division commander, who had immediate communication with Army headquarters, who could coordinate with air support in real time. The entire American military apparatus, from the lieutenant in the field to the generals at headquarters to the pilots in the air, functioned as an integrated system, sharing information and coordinating action with remarkable efficiency. The Germans, by contrast, were operating in a fog of isolation. Elster had been trying for 2 weeks to contact American forces, sending messages that went unanswered or were intercepted by partisans. His communications with his own high command were sporadic. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of the skies, was now so depleted that he had no air cover whatsoever. His units were a mixture of regular soldiers, Soviet turncoats, and garrison troops with little combat experience and declining morale. Or consider resources. When Magill called for air support, 4 P-47s appeared within minutes. They came not because this was a major battle or a crucial objective, but simply because they were available, cruising for targets, part of an overwhelming aerial armada that the Americans could deploy seemingly at will. The Germans had no such luxury. They were out of fuel, out of ammunition, out of food. Their vehicles were running on fumes. Their soldiers were exhausted from weeks of retreat. They were an army in collapse, held together only by discipline and the fear of what would happen if they dissolved into individual fugitives. And finally, consider the psychological dimension. The Americans were winning, and they knew it. From the private soldier to the lieutenant to the general, there was a confidence that came from a string of victories, from knowing that your side had more of everything, from believing that the war would end with your triumph. This confidence allowed Magill to bluff General Elster, to speak with authority he didn't technically possess, to negotiate as though he held all the cards. The Germans, conversely, were losing, and they knew it. Paris had fallen. The Allies were on German soil in the west. The Soviets were crushing the Wehrmacht in the east. The vaunted thousand-year Reich was collapsing after just 12 years. This knowledge, the certainty of defeat, sapped morale, undermined discipline, made surrender seem not just acceptable, but logical. In the end, that's what Magill exploited so brilliantly. He didn't defeat 20,000 Germans. He offered them a way out of a war they had already lost. He showed them that surrender to Americans meant survival, while continued resistance meant death. And 20,000 exhausted, demoralized, but still rational men made the rational choice. Epilogue: what happened after Lieutenant Samuel Magill survived the war. He was promoted to captain, then major, and served in the occupation forces in Germany. After the war, he returned to his home state of Ohio, where he worked as a high school principal for 32 years. He rarely spoke about his military service, and when he did, he downplayed his role at Beaugency. "I was in the right place at the right time," he would say. "Any officer would have done the same." But those who served with him knew differently. Sergeant Paul Hartman, who became a lifelong friend, said in an interview 50 years later, "Sam Magill understood something that day that most people never learn. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is offer your enemy a way to stop fighting. He saved thousands of lives, German and American and French, by being smart enough to see an opportunity and courageous enough to take it." General Elster spent 2 years in a prisoner of war camp in the United States, then returned to Germany after the war. He lived quietly in retirement, never joining veterans organizations, never speaking publicly about his wartime service. He died in 1965 at the age of 74. But before his death, he wrote a letter to Samuel Magill, a letter that Magill's family found among his papers after his death in 1998. In it, Elster wrote, "Dear Lieutenant Magill, I hope this letter finds you well. I am writing to thank you for what you did on September 10th, 1944. You gave me and my men something more valuable than life itself. You gave us the ability to surrender with dignity, to end our war without shame, to survive with our honor intact. I have thought often over the years about that day, about how easily it could have ended in bloodshed and tragedy. Your wisdom and compassion prevented that. You were a worthy enemy and a better victor. I salute you, sir, with respect and gratitude. Yours, Beaugency Elster." The letter hangs today in the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center at Carlisle, Pennsylvania, alongside Magill's Distinguished Service Cross and the detailed after-action report he filed describing the surrender. It serves as a reminder of something essential but easily forgotten, that even in total war, even when nations mobilize all their resources toward each other's destruction, there remain opportunities for humanity, dignity, and wisdom. That one young American lieutenant, outnumbered 400 to 1, chose wisdom over warfare, negotiation over violence, and in doing so achieved what all the bombs and bullets of that terrible war were meant to achieve. He brought 20,000 men safely out of battle and one step closer to peace. That is the lesson of Beaugency. That is why we remember Lieutenant Samuel Magill, not because he killed more of the enemy than anyone else, but because he understood that the truest victory is the one where nobody has to die.